Everything was going swimmingly. Her guests had arrived and began to wander the halls. The meal was being prepared, and she had chosen an outfit for the evening. Yet there was more to do. Wine would have to be chosen. Bloodshed would have to be prevented before the carpets were ruined. And of course, she'd have to wring some information out of Silex. Just on cue, the Ogroni turned a corner and began to approach Charles's band. A duel within the dark hangars of Selene? What wonderful entertainment! Hopefully it wouldn't be over too soon, despite only being to first blood. A servant could see to the wine selection. Culinary matters escaped her, and the meal was not typical of her hall. Now, only one thing remained to be seen to: Silex. She found him in a long gallery which depicted the history of his realm. The tapestries changed constantly, revising the story in an endless chain of cause and effect. He was dressed in beggar's clothes, overgrown with patches of moss. The rest of him matched his outfit, unshaven and ragged. That simply wouldn't do. She wandered down the moonlit hall towards him, taking his attention from the tapestries with a polite cough. A silent moment passed, and Silex turned. He gave a mock bow. "Lady Hattie, I presume?"
This is not an appropriate place for such bloody titles, just as it is not an appropriate place for beggar's garb and grease-slick hair.
"Oh, my dear lady, I am sorry if my appearance offend—" Silex was silenced as the Moonchild raised her hand, and strange shapes tore themselves from the moonlight which flooded the chamber. As he cowered, 100 servants descended on the terrified man. They cut away his tattered clothing and dressed him in tailored finery. He was sitting now, in a chair that had not been there a moment before. Something trimmed his hair with silver scissors, and the Moonchild spoke once more.
That's better, isn't it? Now, how about a little entertainment whilst we talk?
The tapestry before him shifted, revealing itself to depict the ongoing duel within the moon's depths. Silex paused for a moment, considering the sight before him before speaking. "Well, that is certainly a way to make an impression. Do all your guests get this, or am I a special case? That king certainly looks gaudy enough."
I'm afraid I met him like that, lost in those dark fogs which roam your woods. Perhaps you could tell me a little about them.
The thing behind Silex finished with his hair, beginning on his unkempt beard with a long glinting razor. Within the tapestry's infinite duels took place. In one, Charles was crushed to a fine paste. In another, Norio was overcome by a flurry of strikes. Silex raised his voice. "What is it that you seek, child of the dark? Why have you come to my forest? I know the willow would not bring you." The razor slipped. A tiny drop of blood rolled down his neck. The Moonchild stopped it with a finger and flicked it onto the floor. Within the tapestry, something dragged both duelists into the dark.
You seem to misunderstand. You are within my court, and by extension, his court. Now tell me of the dark.
"You're kind." Silex paused, reconsidering his words. "You and your fellow nobles are born of a single drop of dark blood shed in the forging of existence. The thing it was shed from should be dead, yet it cannot understand death, and so it is not. It seeks to surge forth, just as his will does. There was a flash of scarlet light, and a tapestry ignited. It is far greater than his. Another flash. A closer tapestry began to burn. It would rend creation and divinity apart, for it does not understand such things.
What is your place in this, You are ill-suited to be a jailer, and I doubt that damnable tree would provide much resistance.
This isn't a goal for it, but for me. I was bound and forced to trim away paths which drew close to its influence. The willow was my catalyst, and my chains. But it seems my divine kin have found my absence perturbing, and now possess it. The willow is a simple conduit though, and these woods are still mine. The servant behind him was gone, as was his wound. From far off, red flame blazed to contrast the moonlight. The tapestry settled once more, showing a single lead ball streaking towards Norio. Silex averted his eyes. The warrior looked down, and his face twisted in rage at the sight of a deep wound. That would be a suitably amusing end to the duel. His chair was gone too, and Silex stood at the top of an ornate staircase. The Moonchild extended a hand to the now well-dressed and clean-shaven god.
Well, it would be impolite to keep my other guests waiting. Shall we?
A plan had been formed. She doubted it would work, but they did have a plan. The Ogroni would procure their magic fire. Charles would guard Silex, and she would tear apart anyone who troubled that process. Yet something disturbed her peace. Fire was not the way of this realm. She would need something more appropriate. Deep within Selene, newly forged and already slick with blood and oil, was an axe. A horrid thing, which severed godhood with every swing. It was far from perfect. Normally, a woodsman would be prey in such deep forests, but perhaps it would be enough. At the very least, she could take it to a few of the other bands within the forest and fell their leaders like rotten trees. Kobol's band had approached as she parted with Charles, and for a moment she had considered splitting the little creep in half. Charles had other plans, engaging in negotiations while she left with Silex. She had given a parting wave to the engineer, and a smile which contained more teeth than it should. Now Silex sat atop her, eating wild berries while she took a moment to rest. Up ahead was a rift, garrisoned by some minute folk creatures. Perhaps they would agree to allow her access in return for their lives, or perhaps she would test out that new axe. The Willow must have already suspected their plan, for why else would the weather have turned as intense as it did when they had returned to the surface? Or so King Charles XII had thought. But when Silex had been handed to the Moonchild for added security, and she had departed from the Willow's vicinity, the storm suddenly stopped. Why this happened, he did not know. But what he did know was that it would not be wise to wait and find out. So the order was quickly given. They would return to the fort and await reinforcement. Although, the mist which now surrounded the area would be quite troublesome to navigate, but it shouldn't be that much of a problem. Before they could begin the trek, however, another party was spotted in the distance. Could they have been sent by the Willow? It was a risk that could not be taken, and so weapons were readied and the troops were in formation. But battle would not take place. For among the party of human-like beings were some of their own comrades, alive and well. Their leader introduced himself as Kobold of the Theos Titanos, speaking through one of his compatriots, who knew a broken yet elegant German. Apparently, he simply sought information. So as the king sheathed his sword, he saw no harm in humoring him. Kobold was growing impatient. When he had walked into the clearing around the willow, he had noticed the Moonchild, or as she was now known, Lady Hati, conversing with another force. Humans dressed in yellow and blue uniforms, with a man at their head who wore a somewhat muddied but obviously royal uniform. The two seemed in the midst of negotiations. Eventually, the yellow and blue ones had handed over a figure, likely some sort of hostage. Hati had then bounded off in her beast, evidently repaired from their fight. "Kobold," said Dresden Fisher. He was one of the new arrivals to the Fangmoor. The trio of security troops Ignace had called to protect Aggie, his new assistant. For unlike him, she could die in this place. The name called him back to the present, where Dresden was helping them make arrangements with King Charles, the leader of these blue-clad men. Dresden was from a universe very similar to Charles, and could speak a language that he called German, which apparently Charles could as well, and was therefore acting as their translator. "What?" replied Ignace. "He says he wants to know why you're here." "Tell him we're simply here for information." "Yes, sir," Dresden said, turning back to face the monarch. As he relayed the information, His Majesty's face seemed to lose much of its tension. He said some words in German, turning Dresden back to face Kobold. "He says that that's cool with him. He was just here to meet with Lady Hati and deliver Silex to her for safekeeping." "What?" roared Ignace Kobold. "He had Silex?" he said, calming his voice more at the sight of startlement on the faces surrounding him. "That is what he says, sir," said Dresden, still a little rattled from the outburst. "Who is Silex again?" "Ah, yes. Mr. Fisher was new, and hadn't heard about their mission here yet. Silex is the being that this mass of mulch," he said, gesturing at the willow half a mile away, "has demanded we return to it. He's our ticket out of this wooded hell." There was some murmuring between the other two troopers, Quexel and Forman. Dresden shot them a look that Kobold couldn't quite interpret, and didn't particularly care to. He was too busy being frustrated. "Tell Charles that I am willing to let him go on his way without battle, as long as he stays away from our territory. We don't need more death. Not today," Kobold said, with an edge of exasperation in his voice. After a brief exchange between the two humans, King Charles XII of Sweden and his Karelians were on their way. and Kobold could return to his previous business, which had been so rudely interrupted. He left the rest of his host a few dozen yards back and marched up to the willow.
"Greetings, Ignace Kobold. We have been," started that voice that was too perfect to be organic, but did not quite sound artificial.
"Quiet, you overgrown weed," said Kobold, remembering the hurt of his defeat at the hands of the Moonchild. He looked up at the figures flittering among the branches and aimed his guns at them. "Now, you will tell me what I want to know, or I will bring down the wrath of the entire Theos Titanos upon you."
"Oh, little engineer," said the voice with something that sounded like a chuckle. "You do not really have any power to threaten us. However, please, ask your questions."
Kobold narrowed his eyes, glancing around at the various forms all staring directly at him, and he knew that he truly did not have the power here. This was an old place, possibly older than the Titan Kings. If it wanted him put down, it would. "Tell me," he said, repressing any shaking that might be creeping into his voice. "Tell me how to break this place." Norio and his fellows woke up back where they had left, at the foot of an oh-so-familiar shrine. They weren't all too happy to be there. The unreal experience of the previous shrine they visited still on their mind. But the place was quiet and peaceful, and for the Ogroni, it would do for now. It had to, thought Norio, mindlessly wandering around the immense stone construct, confident that if events were going to repeat themselves, they would have done so already. As someone so used to facing problems head-on, the idea of sitting back and letting others carry a majority of the burden was uncomfortable to him. But Kaeda and Naoki, especially, were set on him taking it easy until he was back at full health. So here he was, inspecting the strange thing, while Naoki searched for food and Kaeda scouted around, wincing on occasion as the wound on his side reminded him he wasn't all there yet. Like the last one, the shrine was a pile of stone blocks of varying sizes, wisps of light lazily coming out of it on occasion. He tentatively touched the shrine, and when the shrine failed to react, he confidently ran his hand across his side, getting the feel for it before a flash of resistance and an earthy thunk caught his attention. Laying there on the floor lay a stone slab, in front of the hole from which it was freshly removed. Norio turned the brick over in his hands, pondering how it came free. Turning back to the shrine, Norio noticed that it was different. The general shape was the same, but the slabs were rearranged. The hole he had accidentally made had been fixed. It was then that Naoki returned, a deer hanging limply from her shoulder and a puzzled look on her face.
"What have you got there?"
she asked, getting a wide grin in return. Kaeda frowned as she sat in the bush, observing the little humans. They were an odd bunch, about half the size of regular ones, and dressed in brightly colored clothing. They had built what she could only guess was their idea of a fortress. A great wooden structure with a faint glow coming from its windows, sat at the center of the space with several similar but smaller buildings encircled around it. At the perimeter stood numerous posts, between which some sort of rope, which glowed brightly in a number of colors, had been strung. She considered trying to get a closer look, gauge its strengths, its weaknesses, gauge how something like that could have been built so quickly. But the sight of several animals, some of which already seemed to be agitated, dissuaded her. Having seen enough, she got up and started making her way back to the camp. Between the human fort they had retreated from in the north, the bog to the east, and now the small one's encampment, they were hemmed in, and in no state to push through. Perhaps if they were to find a way through the dense thicket. Either way, she needed to discuss their current predicament with the others. Matters were bad enough being at each other's throats, she thought, as she approached the shrine.
So, we're surrounded, either by enemy positions or impassable terrain,
Norio mused. Kaeda's report had been troubling.
Do we know if they are moving towards us?
No. I heard some noises coming from the direction of the willow. I think something is happening there, but that's as much as I can tell you,
Kaeda replied, truthfully. Something about the whole situation bothered Norio. He went over their time here, day after day, before a thought occurred to him.
Where did that horseman come from?
He muttered to himself. Naoki and Kaeda shared a glance. Where had it come from? They remembered seeing the group when they first arrived in this place, and barring their king, they were all on foot. But both saw the horsemen amongst their ranks back at the ruins. Had they found fellows amongst the forest? Or had they figured out a means to call forth allies without the moon? Could they recreate it?
However the means, our priority should be securing our position. There is no point in pondering such matters if we lose what we have,
Norio said, getting nodded agreement from the others.
Fortunately, the stones of the shrine can be removed without it collapsing, and, well, we have no shortage of lumber. So let's get to work, he concluded, raising to his feet. The building process was curious. The process was no different to how they had done it when working with the builders, doing what they did know and figuring out what they couldn't. But time seemed to stretch throughout. Elements, tools, days, weeks even, but also barely a moment. As unpleasant a thought that was, their castle was done, and they looked upon it fondly. It was a modest fort. A small walled mound with a sizable building that sat at the heart of it. Not much compared to the grand spectacles back home. Home. Thoughts of home, of family, of friends came to them as they looked at their work. Heading inside to the central building, past the rudimentary rooms and to what remained of the shrine, now little more than a pile of rocks that came up to their waist. Putting their hand atop it, the Agroni thought about wanting to see it again, if only for the briefest of moments. Light. Faint at first, but growing brighter by the moment, shone from the shrine. Crackles of energy bounced around it and the rest of the rocks the fort had been made of. Patterns danced across all of the surfaces as the whole place began to shake. The group ran out of the building, years of training taking hold. Just in time to see a great pulse shoot out from behind them, into the trees and out of sight.
What was that?
Naoki asked. but Norio couldn't think of an answer, instead walking back inside, both to make sure their new home was safe and to investigate a light coming from inside. He stopped at the entrance, stunned by the sight. A rift above the shrine, full of familiar sights. Home. You cannot threaten one who does not care about their own death. Delivering that death to them will only make them more resolute. I suppose this is the mistake we made. We were too bold in assuming the fears of our enemies, and thus we paid the price. Lysath was torn apart by their hounds. He was too confident in his abilities. I was felled by their heavy weaponry. I was too certain of my armor's strength. Sirocco remained stunned in the shadows, outsmarted by their cunning. She dragged me back to the sisters' simulacrum. We assumed they would kneel in the rivers of blood we carved into them, but they did not. Oh, I feel free! This is the freedom that Sirocco felt, I am sure, as she gave up her mortal form to the sisters. One less thing to lose. Silex. What is he? The willow wants him. That desire betrays weakness. It betrays fear. It wants. Therefore, it can lose. How I long to make it fear. How I want it to suffer. No. The forest drains my sanity, while it drinks the blood of our fallen. I do not want to remain here. Not here. If Silex reaches the willow, there will be no escape for us. How much time do we have left before one of these deluded fools delivers him on a golden platter? 1 day? 2, perhaps? 2 will be enough. We will be 1 step ahead. Captain Vega Iridian of the Cygnus, respond immediately. High Commodore Antares Orionis calls upon you with an urgent message. Your requests for additional ground troops have been denied due to being deemed unnecessary. However, the Council of Supremacy and Commodoriate of High Dominion Insidian have agreed upon the worth of this mission, and I have come to reinforce you on Operation Nevergreen. The Fangmoor will henceforth be under the Naves Calier of Ultimatum. At your command are the weapons of the XLNC Ishaton Eternal, XLNC Kaleyuga, and XLNC Ragnarok. Glory be to the Lunar Pact. The watchful moon judges all who stalk the night.